Hello, everyone, and welcome back to New Testament in a Nutshell. I'm Claire K. Rothschild, and in this video, we will continue our discussion with the Gospel of Matthew. As you know, for each Gospel, I cover 4 topics: authorship, date and provenance, sources, and purpose. Our topic today is the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew. The first important thing to learn about the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew is that it was originally anonymous. That is, the author did not sign his name as far as we know. As I mentioned in a previous video, my friend Simon Gathercole at Cambridge University in England thinks that, although the Gospel manuscripts we have are unsigned, and even if the original manuscripts were unsigned, the authors were nevertheless known, and thus the present attributions are accurate. But here we will stick with the manuscript evidence we have, accepting that all 4 Gospels were originally anonymous, attributed sometime in the 2nd century to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. While there is little hope of recovering the identity of the original authors, scholars nevertheless seek to explain the attributions. There are basically 4 theories to explain Matthean attribution. They are Matthew, aka Levi, Matthew, the disciple and translator, Matthew as eyewitness, and Matthew as anonymous scribe. As we will see, these 4 options are not mutually exclusive. The first explanation of Matthean attribution involves Mark, so let's begin there. You may recall that in Mark 2:14, after Peter and Andrew and James and John all dropped their fishing nets to follow Jesus, it says, "As he was walking along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he got up and followed him." That is, Levi joined the 5 men, making 6. We don't hear specifically about where Jesus drummed up his other disciples, but by chapter 3, verse 16, he has accrued 12. The passage reads, "So he appointed the 12, Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter, James, son of Zebedee, and John, the brother of James, to whom he gave the name Boanerges, that is, sons of thunder, and Andrew, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Cananean, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him." Notice anything odd about this list? Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, Thaddeus, Simon the Cananean, and Judas. Anything odd? Where is Levi? He not only left his tax collecting booth to follow Jesus, but he hosted him at his home for dinner. And now, it is as if he made the team but never leaves the bench. Sad, don't you think? As you know, Matthew copies Mark verbatim. Almost 100% of the material in Mark can be found somewhere in Matthew. So let's read Matthew's version of this story. In Matthew 9:9 we read, "As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, 'Follow me.' And he got up and followed him." Virtually identical to Mark, with the exception of one thing. Do you notice it? The tax collector's name is Matthew, not Levi. And if we then turn to Matthew's version of the list of the disciples in chapter 10, verse 2, we see that it is the same as Mark's, although in a slightly different order. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the Cananean, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Thomas, Matthew the tax collector, James, Thaddeus, Simon, and Judas. You will notice that in Matthew's list, Matthew is even designated the tax collector. There are two possible explanations for this. Either the author of Matthew knows that Levi was also known as Matthew and changes the name so that when the name Matthew appears in the list of 12, no one is confused. Or Matthew modifies the call story of Levi from Mark into a call story about a man who eventually makes the list of 12. That is about Matthew. Because it is awkward that Jesus asks, maybe even commands someone to leave his full-time job and follow him, who then doesn't make the final cut of 12. What does this have to do with the attribution of this gospel to Matthew? Well, either the author was this tax collector, faces this confusion of his two names frequently, and simply irons it out here, or this gospel became famous as the gospel in which Levi's name is switched to Matthew, and it's dubbed the Matthew Gospel on account of this quirk. I want to read that gospel, the one in which Levi is called Matthew, the Matthew Gospel. The second theory is based on another quotation from Papias. Remember him? Papias was a Christian bishop in the city of Hierapolis around the year 130 CE. Hierapolis, famous for its hot springs. Little of what Papias wrote remains to us, but the Emperor Constantine's court historian Eusebius had Papias's writing, and Eusebius quotes Papias on the authorship of the four Gospels. About Matthew, Papias writes, "The disciple Matthew collected the sayings in the Hebrew language, and each one translated them as he was able." Very interesting. Papias seems to allege that the disciple Matthew the tax collector kept a collection of Jesus' sayings in Hebrew, and that anyone who knew Greek translated them. There are two issues. Jesus' sayings would not have been in Hebrew because Jesus spoke Aramaic, a similar yet different language from Hebrew. But let's just say that Papias doesn't know the difference and refers to Aramaic as Hebrew. Perfect. So then we have that the disciple Matthew had a list of Jesus' sayings. What list do you know of Jesus' sayings? Right, Q. Does Matthew have Q? Well, according to this two-source hypothesis, that is the theory that Matthew and Luke composed their Gospels based on two separate written sources, Mark and Q, he does. So, some scholars believe that here Papias provides external evidence of the existence of Q. The disciple Matthew had Q, and anyone who knew Greek could translate the sayings. Not so fast. What language is the Gospel of Matthew written in? Right, Greek. So if Q is defined as verbatim agreement between Matthew and Luke, not in Mark, what language is Q in? Right. Q is, by definition, in Greek. Where does that leave us? Q was originally a list of some sayings of Jesus in Aramaic, Papias refers to it as Hebrew, collected by the tax collector Matthew, known as Levi in Matthew's source Mark, and translated into Greek by unknown bilingual Christians who ultimately published them as the hypothetical document we call Q. I'm a pretty daring scholar, but that theory is too risky even for me. Remember the House of Cards? Okay, so where does that leave us? Basically nowhere. Although scholars regard Papias's early 2nd century witness about gospel authorship as extremely important evidence, we simply are not sure what to do with his comment about Matthew. Disappointing, I realize, but let's move on. The third theory involves Markan priority, the argument that Mark is our oldest gospel, and that it was used as a written source criticism, by the authors of Matthew and Luke to compose their gospels. Right off the bat, can you think of anything problematic relating to Markan priority with the attribution of Matthew's gospel to Matthew? Recall that, based on Mark 15:21, the passage about Simon of Cyrene and his children Alexander and Rufus, we postulated that Mark was a second or third generation Christian writing sometime in or after the year 70 CE. So why would attributing the name of one of Jesus' disciples to a gospel that incorporates Mark be a problem? I can think of at least two reasons. First, when was the Gospel of Matthew written? Well, we don't know, and we'll discuss it in the next lecture. But for now, we can say, if we accept Mark in priority, that it was written sometime after Mark. So maybe 85 or 90 CE, or maybe even later. Would Jesus' disciple Matthew be alive in 85 CE? Presuming Matthew the tax collector was around Jesus' age when he followed Jesus, perhaps he was even a little bit older than Jesus, he would be around 85 in 85 CE. And given the average lifespan of an adult male at that time, very unlikely to be alive. Second, if you had been an actual disciple of Jesus, would you write a gospel borrowing verbatim from someone who had never met Jesus? Someone who lived maybe 40 years after Jesus died? Probably not. Here, then, we run into a fairly significant problem with the attribution of Matthew's gospel. Namely, it appears that the attribution, whether original to the gospel or added later, is competitive. It is attempting to seize for this gospel eyewitness authority. Read this gospel instead of Mark's gospel because it was written by an eyewitness. And yet, it probably wasn't written by an eyewitness because it was composed after 70 CE and incorporates material from Mark, who was not an eyewitness and doesn't even pretend to be. Finally, the fourth theory. It is, well, it's hardly even a theory. It's more like a clever idea. In Matthew chapter 13, verse 51, Jesus asks his disciples if they understand him. They answer, yes. The disciples always understand Jesus in Matthew, and they never understand him in Mark. Remember the purpose of the Gospel of Mark. Jesus then offers an enigmatic statement found only in this Gospel. He says, "Therefore, every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household, who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." What does that mean? Who are kingdom of heaven scribes? Note that Matthew prefers heaven for God when referring to the kingdom of God. Any guesses why? So who is this scribe? For this, we will turn to art history. The 17th century Dutch painter Rembrandt painted a famous picture of Jesus' disciples in the boat with him during the storm. We read this passage from Mark in the last episode. Side note, this oil on canvas painting, which Rembrandt made in 1633, used to be in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, but it was stolen in 1990 and remains missing. 2 thieves disguised as police officers broke into the museum and stole it with 12 other works in what is considered to be the biggest art theft in U.S. history. Back to our point. This painting depicts the miracle of Jesus calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee, specifically as it is described in the 4th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. In this painting, all 12 disciples are there, plus Jesus. Plus one more person. Yep, 13 disciples. Count them. Guess who the 13th disciple is? It's Rembrandt. Rembrandt depicts himself in the foreground, looking directly at the viewer. It is as if he is saying that his life as a Christian sometimes feels like he's on a boat in the rocky seas about to capsize and Jesus is sleeping. Have a sense of what that feels like? Anyway, how does this apply to the kingdom scribe in Matthew? Well, some people think that in this saying, Matthew is referring to himself. He wrote himself into his gospel. He is the scribe, trained for the kingdom, bringing out of his treasure what is new and what is old. So what is Matthew's treasure? It is the Jewish scriptures. but that is a subject for a future video. So what can we conclude? Well, we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Matthew. We can't even be sure his name was Matthew. But it is very unlikely to be an original follower of Jesus, even though the attribution might want us to think so. A quick glimpse at the authorship of the Gospel of Matthew. Join me in the next episode to learn about the date and provenance of this Gospel.